The moment Maya told her ex-husband she was pregnant in the middle of Lumineur's dining, she expected rage or denial. Not for a billionaire stranger to claim her unborn child as his own. Marcus collapsed to the floor in front of dozens of witnesses, and Maya realized her life had just divided into before and after, with no way back to the safety of invisibility. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Some moments arrive with the weight of destiny wrapped in the mundane fabric of an ordinary evening. For Maya Torres, a 28-year-old waitress balancing on the knife's edge of financial ruin, that moment came in the form of two words she never expected to say out loud. For Adrian Westwood, a man whose billions had insulated him from genuine human connection, it came as an offer that would either redeem him or destroy everything he'd carefully constructed. She was just trying to survive another shift at Lumineure, the kind of restaurant where a single appetizer cost more than her weekly grocery budget. He was just another wealthy patron in a sea of suits and silk ties. But when her ex-husband walked through those mahogany doors, the careful distance she'd maintained between her two worlds shattered like fine crystal hitting marble. This isn't a romance. This is the story of how a confession in an upscale dining room became a declaration of war, how desperation met opportunity, and how three lives collided in a moment that would rewrite all their future. The amber glow of Lumineure's crystal chandeliers cast everything in a golden haze that felt both warm and impossibly distant. Maya Torres moved through the dining room with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to be invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to read the subtle language of the wealthy with the fluency of survival. Her black uniform was pressed to perfection, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek bun that made her look older than her years, more composed than she felt. The fabric of her white apron concealed the secret she'd been carrying for 3 months, the truth that kept her awake at night calculating impossible math between prenatal vitamins and overdue rent. It was a Thursday evening, that peculiar lull between the early dinner crowd and the late-night reservation holders who treated dining as theater. Maya had just finished setting table 7, arranging the silverware with the precision of a surgeon, when she felt it, that instinctive tightening in her chest that meant her carefully constructed piece was about to be shattered. She looked up, and there he was. Marcus Torres, her ex-husband, standing in the entrance of Lumineure like a ghost from a life she'd fought desperately to leave behind. He looked different, better than she remembered, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her car, his usually unruly hair styled with expensive product, but it was still Marcus, still the man who had promised her forever, and delivered exactly 11 months before walking out the door with his secretary, leaving Maya with nothing but a rented apartment full of his unpaid debts, and a heart that had learned the hard way that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Their eyes met across the dining room. She watched the surprise flicker across his face, followed quickly by something that looked uncomfortably like pity. He was with a woman, of course, blonde and elegant, wearing diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. Maya's hand instinctively moved to her stomach, a protective gesture she'd developed over the past weeks. And then she forced herself to drop it. She couldn't let him see. She couldn't let anyone see. Not yet. Not when she was still 3 weeks away from being eligible for the restaurant's health insurance. Still calculating whether she could afford to keep this baby or whether the responsible choice, the survivable choice, was something she couldn't bear to think about. Maya turned away, retreating toward the kitchen, but Carlo, the maître d', intercepted her with his usual impeccable timing. Table 12, Maya, VIP client. M.R. Westwood. His voice carried the reverent tone reserved for the restaurant's most valued patrons, the ones whose tips could cover a month's rent, whose reservations were marked in the book with small stars. Table 12 was in her section, positioned in the corner with a view of the city lights, the kind of table that suggested both power and a desire for privacy. She nodded, grabbed a menu and a pitcher of ice water, and forced her professional smile into place. Whatever happened, she couldn't afford to lose this job. She'd survived seeing Marcus, she'd survived worse. As she approached table 12, she found herself studying the man who sat there with the kind of absolute stillness that spoke of complete self-assurance. Adrian Westwood was a name she'd heard whispered in the kitchen. A tech billionaire who'd built an empire from algorithms and ambition, who owned half the city's skyline and could buy the other half before breakfast. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray, like storm clouds over steel. His suit was charcoal, perfectly tailored, and he wore it with the casual indifference of someone who'd never had to worry about the cost of anything. He was reading something on his phone, his expression remote and analytical, like a mathematician working through a particularly complex equation. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Lumineure. Can I start you with something to drink?" Maya's voice was steady, professional, giving nothing away. He looked up, and for a moment those gray eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly uncomfortably visible. It wasn't the way most men looked at her, that casual assessment that tried to determine her availability or attractiveness. This was different. Sharper, like he was seeing past the uniform and the practiced smile to something underneath, something true. "Scotch," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Macallan 25, neat, and take your time with dinner." I'm expecting someone who's chronically late." There was no rudeness in his tone, just a statement of fact delivered with the efficiency of a man who valued precision. Maya nodded, turned to leave, and that's when she heard it. That laugh. Marcus's laugh, loud and performative, coming from across the dining room. She glanced over her shoulder and saw him at his table, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who'd finally made it, who'd clawed his way up from the wreckage of their failed marriage and landed in a place that felt like winning. The blonde woman was laughing too, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Maya felt something twist in her chest, not jealousy exactly, but something close to it. Something that tasted like injustice and regret. She delivered the scotch to Mr. Westwood, and as she set it down, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, the kind that had become familiar over the past few weeks. The nausea wasn't just morning sickness anymore. It was an all-day companion, a constant reminder of the impossible choice growing inside her. She steadied herself against the edge of the table just for a moment, just long enough to catch her breath. "Are you all right?" The question came from Adrian Westwood, and when she looked at him, she saw something unexpected in those gray eyes. Concern, not the performative kind, not the polite social gesture, but genuine worry from a man who'd noticed what everyone else had overlooked. "I'm fine," Maya said quickly, straightening. "Just a long shift." She forced the smile back into place, but she could feel his gaze on her. Assessing, analyzing, seeing far too much. She excused herself and retreated to the server station, pressing her hand against the cool marble counter and willing her heart to slow down, her stomach to settle, her world to stop tilting on its axis. She couldn't fall apart. Not here. Not now. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans, because at that moment Marcus Torres stood up from his table and started walking directly toward her. His expression was a complicated mixture of surprise, guilt, and something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction, like he'd been waiting for this moment, this chance to show her how far he'd climbed since he'd left her in the rubble of their marriage. "Maya?" His voice carried across the dining room and several heads turned. She felt the weight of those stares. The curiosity of the wealthy who treated other people's private dramas like entertainment. "My God, I didn't know you were working here. How are you?" There was false concern in his voice, the kind that made her skin crawl. She knew what he was really asking. "How are you surviving without me? Have you learned your lesson yet? Have you realized that I was the best you were ever going to do?" She opened her mouth to deliver the polite, neutral response that would end this interaction quickly, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Is there a problem here?" Adrian Westwood had materialized beside her, his presence commanding immediate attention. He wasn't particularly tall, maybe 6 feet, but he carried himself with the kind of authority that made physical height irrelevant. He was looking at Marcus with cool appraisal, the way a wolf might regard a rabbit that had wandered too close to the den. Marcus blinked, clearly not expecting interference. "No problem. I was just saying hello to my ex-wife." The words hung in the air, loaded with implication and barely concealed contempt. Adrian's gaze shifted to Maya, those gray eyes asking a silent question, and in that moment she felt something crack inside her, the careful wall she'd built between her public face and her private truth. The words came out before she could stop them, quiet but clear, carrying across the suddenly silent section of the dining room. "I'm pregnant, Marcus." Quote, the confession was both liberation and devastation. She watched his face change, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched shock give way to calculation as his mind raced through implications and timelines. 3 months, she continued, her voice steady now, emboldened by finally speaking the truth out loud. 3 months since you signed the divorce papers and disappeared with Jennifer from accounting. She gestured toward the blonde woman at his table who was watching the scene unfold with wide eyes and an expression that suggested she was rapidly reevaluating her life choices. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "That's," he started, then stopped. "You can't." Another false start. Maya felt tears prick at her eyes, hot and humiliating, but she refused to let them fall. She'd cried enough over Marcus Torres. She wouldn't give him any more of her tears. And that's when Adrian Westwood did something that would change everything. He reached out and took Maya's hand, his touch warm and steady, grounding her in the midst of the chaos. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the dining room with absolute clarity and unshakable confidence. "And I'll be the father." The words landed like a bomb in the stunned silence of Luminar. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned to witness this impossible declaration. Marcus stared at Adrian Westwood, his expression shifting from shock to confusion to something that looked dangerously close to rage. Maya felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the world tilt and spin, felt the weight of every gaze in the restaurant pressing down on her like a physical force. "What?" Marcus finally managed, his voice cracking. "Who the hell are you?" Adrian Westwood released Maya's hand and stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Marcus with the predatory grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in boardrooms where wars were fought with words and won with will. "I'm Adrian Westwood, and as of this moment, I'm the most important person in Miss Torres's life." The challenge was unmistakable, delivered with such quiet intensity that it carried more weight than any shout. Marcus tried to rally, tried to find his footing in a situation that had spiraled completely out of his control. "This is insane. You can't just..." But Adrian cut him off with a raised hand and a look that could have frozen fire. "I can do whatever I choose, and I choose this." He turned to Maya, and in his eyes she saw something she couldn't quite name. It looked like understanding, like recognition, like he'd been waiting his entire life for this exact moment. This chance to do something that mattered beyond profit margins and stock prices. If you'll allow it, he added, the question directed solely at her, giving her the power to accept or refuse this impossible offer. Maya's mind raced. This was madness. This was a stranger, a billionaire who owed her nothing, offering to claim a child that wasn't his, to shoulder a burden he had no reason to carry. It made no sense. But as she looked at Marcus, at the fury and disbelief on his face, at the way he'd reduced their entire marriage to a transaction he'd won by leaving, she felt something fierce and defiant rise up inside her. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong. Yes, I'll allow it. And that's when Marcus Torres collapsed, his knees buckling, his expensive suit crumpling as he fell to the polished floor of Luminar in a faint that would become the talk of the city's social circles for months to come. Chaos has a sound. In the aftermath of Adrian Westwood's declaration and Marcus Torres's dramatic collapse, that sound was collective gasp of Luminor's distinguished patron, followed by the frantic scraping of chairs as people rose from their tables to witness the spectacle. The blonde woman, Jennifer, rushed to Marcus's side with a theatrical cry that suggested more concern for the attention than for the man himself. Carlo, the mater d', appeared with the speed of someone whose entire career had been spent managing the embarrassing indiscretions of the wealth, already on his phone calling for medical assistance while simultaneously calculating how to spin this disaster into something resembling discretion. Maya stood frozen, her hand still tingling from where Adrian had held it, her mind trying to process what had just happened. One moment she'd been hiding her pregnancy, desperately clinging to her job and her dignity. The next she'd confessed everything in front of dozens of witnesses, and a billionaire stranger had claimed her unborn child as his own. It felt like falling, like standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing too late that the ground beneath her feet was already gone. She should feel grateful. She should feel relieved. Instead, she felt terrified because nothing in life came without a price, and she couldn't begin to imagine what Adrian Westwood would expect in return for this impossible gift. Adrian himself seemed completely unaffected by the chaos swirling around them. He stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the scene with the detached interest of someone observing a particularly fascinating social experiment. When the paramedics arrived, pushing through the crowd with practiced efficiency, he stepped back just enough to give them room while maintaining a protective proximity to Maya that didn't go unnoticed by the restaurant's gossip-hungry patrons. Marcus was coming around, his eyes fluttering open with the confusion of someone waking from a nightmare only to discover it was real. He looked up at Jennifer, then past her to where Maya and Adrian stood together, and the fury that fluttered his face was almost frightening in its intensity. "This is insane," Marcus said, his voice hoarse as the paramedics helped him to a sitting position. He waved away their attempts to check his vital signs, his attention fixed solely on Maya. "That baby is mine. We were still married 3 months ago." The accusation hung in the air, and Maya felt the weight of judgment from every person in the room. She opened her mouth to explain, to defend herself, but Adrian spoke first, his voice cutting through the noise with surgical precision. "The divorce was finalized 4 months ago, Mir Torres. I checked." His tone was conversational, but there was steel underneath it, which means that any relationship Torres chose to pursue afterward is none of your concern. As for paternity, I believe that's a matter between Torres and myself. The casual dismissal was devastating. Adrian had reduced Marcus to irrelevance in a single breath, and everyone in the restaurant could see it. Marcus struggled to his feet, shaking off Jennifer's attempts to steady him, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. "You can't do this," he spat, though it wasn't clear whether he was speaking to Maya or Adrian. "You can't just buy your way into someone's life and play hero. This is my child." Adrian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, something cold and absolutely unyielding. "Actually, Mr. Torres, I can do exactly that. I have resources you can't imagine and lawyers who could tie you up in court for the next decade if I chose. But I won't need to because Ms. Torres is going to walk out of this restaurant with me tonight, and you're never going to bother her again." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact, delivered with the certainty of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. Maya felt the ground tilt beneath her feet again, felt the surreal quality of the moment wash over her like a wave. This was happening too fast. Everything was spiraling out of control, and she was a passenger in her own life, watching decisions being made around her and about her without her input. She put her hand on Adrian's arm, feeling the expensive fabric of his suit jacket beneath her fingers, and when he turned to look at her, she saw something flicker across his face. Concern. Real, genuine concern that softened the edges of his commanding presence and reminded her that underneath the billionaire facade was a human being who'd just upended his own life for reasons she still didn't understand. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly, The words meant only for him, somewhere private? Adrian nodded, then turned to Carlo, who was hovering nearby like an anxious mother hen. We'll need the private dining room. Carlo opened his mouth to protest that it was reserved, took one look at Adrian's expression and thought better of it. Of course, Mr. Westwood. Right this way. He led them through the restaurant, past the staring faces and whispered conversations that would fuel social media posts and society column inches for weeks to come. Maya was acutely aware of every eye on her, of the speculation and judgment that followed her like a shadow. She'd worked so hard to be invisible, to keep her private struggles private. And now she was the star of a drama she'd never auditioned for. The private dining room was a study in elegant simplicity, with cream-colored walls, a single table set for 8, and a view of the city that seemed to stretch into infinity. As soon as Carlo closed the door behind them, the noise of the restaurant faded to a distant murmur, and Maya found herself alone with Adrian Westwood in a silence that felt both intimate and terrifying. She turned to face him, and all the questions she'd been suppressing came rushing out in a flood of desperate confusion. Why did you do that? Who are you? What do you want from me? The words tumbled over each other, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of the evening's impossible events. Adrian walked to the window, his hands still in his pockets, his profile sharp against the city lights. For a long moment he didn't speak, and Maya wondered if he was regretting his impulsive declaration, if he was calculating the fastest way to extract himself from the mess he'd created. But when he finally turned to face her, his expression was thoughtful, almost vulnerable, stripped of the armor of certainty he'd worn in the dining room. I did it because I could, he said simply, and because nobody else was going to. Those gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I watched you all evening, Miss Torres. I watched you work with a grace and dignity that most people never achieve in their entire lives. I saw you steady yourself against my table when you thought nobody was looking. I saw the way your hand moved to your stomach, protective and afraid. And when your ex-husband approached you, I saw something break in your eyes. Some last shred of hope that the world might be kind. Maya felt tears threatening again, but she blinked them back furiously. That doesn't explain why you'd claim a child that isn't yours. Do you understand what you've done? What people will think? What Marcus will do? He'll fight this. He'll make both our lives hell. Adrian smiled, but it was a cold expression, the smile of a predator spotting prey. Let him try. I have 17 billion reasons why he'll lose, and every single one of them is currently sitting in various investment portfolios earning interest. He crossed the room until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the expensive watch on his wrist that probably cost more than her entire year's salary. But money isn't why I did this, Miss Torres. I did it because I'm 42 years old. I've built an empire, and I've never done a single thing that mattered. Not really. Not in a way that would outlive me. Not in a way that made me feel human. The confession was so raw, so unexpected, that Maya forgot her fear for a moment. She studied his face, seeing past the wealth and power to something lonelier, something broken in a different way than her own brokenness. You don't know me, she said softly. I could be anyone. I could be using you. Adrian laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face. You could be, but you're not. I've spent 2 decades reading people, Miss Torres. It's how I've survived in a world where everyone wants something from me. You're not a schemer. You're not a gold digger. You're terrified, exhausted, and trying desperately to do the right thing in a situation where there are no right answers. That's why I trust you. He reached out and gently took her hand again, and this time she didn't pull away. I'm not offering to buy your child. I'm offering to give you a choice you didn't have 5 minutes. Security, safety, and the freedom to raise your baby without fear. In exchange, all I ask is that you let me be part of something real. Maya looked down at their joined hand, at the contrast between his manicured nails and her work-roughened fingers, and she thought about the impossible mathematics of her life. The rent she couldn't pay, the medical bills that were coming, the precarious tightrope she'd been walking between survival and surrender. She thought about Marcus's face when he'd fallen, about the rage and the possessiveness of a man who'd abandoned her but couldn't bear to see her claimed by someone else. She thought about the child growing inside her, about all the futures that child might have and all the ones it would be denied if she made the wrong choice now. This is crazy, she whispered. People don't do things like this. People like me don't get rescued by billionaires. It doesn't happen in real life. Adrian's grip on her hand tightened, just slightly, a reassurance and a promise. It's happening right now, he said. The question is whether you're brave enough to let it. The word brave hit her like a physical blow. She'd never thought of herself as brave. Brave was for heroes and risk-takers, for people who had something to lose. She was just a waitress trying to survive, just a woman who'd made a mistake and was paying for it in 1,000 small humiliations every single day. But maybe, she thought, maybe brave was also this. Maybe brave was accepting help even when you didn't understand it. Maybe brave was trusting a stranger because the alternative was drowning alone. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders like a crown or a noose. She couldn't quite tell which. Okay, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Okay, I'll let you help me, but I need to understand the term. What exactly are you offering, Mr. Westwood? Adrian released her hand and walked back to the table, pulling out a chair in a gesture that was somehow both courtly and commanding. Please sit. We have a great deal to discuss, and I suspect your feet are tired from your shift. As Maya sank into the chair, feeling the expensive leather conform to her body, she realized that her life had just divided into two distinct chapters. There was before the world of struggle and Marcus and impossible choices. And there was after this new uncertain territory where billionaires made impossible promises and nothing was quite what it seemed. Adrian sat across from her, his hands folded on the table between them, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man about to rewrite both their futures. Here's what I proposed. The proposal, when it came, was delivered with the same precision Adrian Westwood likely used in boardroom negotiations worth billions. But this wasn't about mergers or acquisitions. This was about a life, a child, and two broken people trying to forge something meaningful from the wreckage of their separate disappointments. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes never leaving Maya's face, and began to outline an arrangement that was equal parts practical and utterly surreal. First, he said, his voice calm and methodical, you'll move out of wherever you're currently living. I'm guessing it's not suitable for a pregnant woman, let alone a newborn. Maya felt her cheeks flush with shame. She lived in a studio apartment in a building where the heat worked sporadically, and the neighbors conducted their domestic disputes at volumes that made sleep a luxury. It was all she could afford on a waitress's salary, and even that required her to skip meals more often than she'd ever admit to anyone. There's a property in Riverside Heights, Adrian continued, reading her silence correctly. A townhouse, 3 bedrooms, fully furnished, security system, close to the best hospital in the city. Currently sitting empty. You'll live there, rent-free, all utilities covered. Maya's mouth went dry. Riverside Heights was where the city's elite lived, where tree-lined streets were cleaned twice daily, and where a single month's rent would cost more than she made in a year. That's too much, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't accept that. Adrian's expression didn't change. You can and you will. Because you need to be somewhere safe, somewhere stress-free so that pregnancy stays healthy. This isn't charity, Miss Torres, this is investment. I'm investing in the well-being of a child I've just claimed as my own. The practicality of it shouldn't have been comforting, but somehow it was. He wasn't offering her a fantasy. He was offering her a transaction, something with clear terms and boundaries, something that made sense in a situation that defied all logic. Second, Adrian said, you'll quit your job at Billionaire. Effective immediately. Maya started to protest, but he held up a hand. You're on your feet for hours, dealing with difficult people, breathing in kitchen smoke and stress. That ends tonight. I'll provide you with a monthly stipend, enough to cover all your expenses and more. You focus on staying healthy, on preparing for the baby. That's your only job now. The relief that flooded through her was so intense it was almost painful. For 3 months she'd been terrified of taking time off, of losing her income, of the moment when her body would betray her condition, and Carlo would quietly suggest she take permanent leave. Now with a few words, Adrian was removing that fear entirely, was giving her the impossible luxury of rest. But the practical part of her mind, the part that had been hardened by Marcus's betrayal and years of barely scraping by, couldn't quite accept it. And what do you get out of this? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Nobody does something like this without expecting something in return. Adrian was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming softly on the table. A small tell that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. What I get, he said finally, is legitimacy. I'm 42 years old, Miss Torres. I've spent the last 2 decades building an empire, and in that time I've become something of a recluse. The press loves to speculate about my personal life, to create narratives about why I'm not married, why I don't date publicly, why I seem to exist solely for my work. The truth is simpler than they imagine. I'm lonely, I'm tired, and I've realized that all the money in the world can't buy the one thing I actually want, which is to be part of something that matters beyond profit margins and stock prices. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. Your child, this baby you're carrying, gives me a chance to be a father, a real father. Not biologically, I understand that, but in every way that counts. In exchange, I give you security, resources, and protection from people like your ex-husband who would use your vulnerability against you. Maya studied his face, searching for the lie, the hidden agenda, the trap that her experience told her must be lurking beneath this too-good-to-be-true offer. But all she saw was a man who looked as exhausted as she felt, who carried his own burden of loneliness and regret, who was reaching across the vast gulf of their different worlds looking for connection. You'd want to be involved? She asked slowly. In the baby's life? Not just... She hesitated. Not just financially? Adrian's expression softened, and for the first time that evening he smiled with genuine warmth. I want to be there for doctor's appointments, if you'll let me. I want to help pick out furniture for the nursery. I want to hold my child, he said the words with emphasis, making them real, making them his, for the first time, and know that I'm doing something that actually matters. I don't want to be a checkbook, Miss Torres, I want to be a father. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and Maya felt something shift inside her, felt the defensive walls she'd built around her heart crack just slightly. This man, this stranger with his billions and his loneliness, was offering her more than Marcus ever had. Marcus had promised forever and delivered abandonment. Adrian was promising nothing but honesty and a chance for both of them to build something real from broken pieces. But there was one more question, the one that had been gnawing at her since this impossible evening began. "What about Marcus?" she asked, and she couldn't keep the fear from her voice. "He's not going to just walk away. He'll fight this. He'll claim paternity. Adrian cut her off with a gesture that was almost gentle. "Marcus Torres is a middle management executive at a commercial real estate firm making approximately $90,000 a year. He lives in a rented condo, drives a leased BMW, and has $37,000 in credit card debt. He's dating his former coworker, Jennifer Matthews, who is currently embroiled in a sexual harassment complaint at her previous employer." Maya stared at him, stunned. "How do you know all that?" "I made some calls while you were serving other tables," Adrian said calmly. "I have people who are very good at gathering information quickly. My point is this. Marcus Torres can file for paternity all he wants. He can drag us into court. He can make noise. But at the end of the day, I have resources he can't match, and lawyers who eat people like him for breakfast. More importantly, once you move into the townhouse, once you're under my protection, he won't be able to touch you. I'll make sure of it." There was something both reassuring and slightly terrifying about the casual display of power. The way Adrian could dissect a person's entire life with a few phone calls. The way he could promise protection with the certainty of someone who'd never been denied anything. But Maya was beyond the luxury of being afraid. She was drowning, and Adrian Westwood was offering her a lifeline. She just had to be brave enough to grab it. "Okay," she said, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff into open air. "Okay, I accept your terms, but I have some of my own." Adrian's eyebrows rose slightly, and she thought she detected a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Go on," he said. "First," Maya began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "I want legal documentation of everything. I don't care how much you trust me or how much I'm learning to trust you. I need it in writing. The housing, the stipend, your rights and responsibilities as the baby's father. Everything clear and legally binding. I won't be left vulnerable again." "Smart," Adrian said, nodding. "My lawyers will draw up the papers. What else?" "Second, I want to be able to make decisions about my child's upbringing. Yes, you'll be the father, but I'm the mother. I won't be overruled or dismissed. We make major decisions together or this doesn't work." Adrian extended his hand across the table. "Agreed." Maya took his hand, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. And for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this impossible situation might actually work. They shook on it. Two people from completely different worlds forging a partnership built on mutual need and a desperate hope for something better. And in that moment, in that private dining room overlooking the city lights, Maya Torres and Adrian Westwood became something neither of them had expected. They became allies, bound together by a lie that felt more honest than any truth either of them had lived in years. When they finally emerged from the private dining room, the restaurant had returned to a semblance of normalcy. Marcus and Jennifer were gone, presumably having fled the scene of his humiliation. But Carlo was waiting, his expression a mixture of professional concern and barely concealed curiosity. "Mr. Westwood," he began, his voice unctuous, "I hope everything is satisfactory. If there's anything we can do to—" Adrian cut him off with a raised hand. "Ms. Torres will be resigning effective immediately. I trust you'll forward her final paycheck to my office. She won't be returning to collect it." Carlo's eyes widened, but he was too professional to protest. "Of course, Mr. Westwood." "Maya, it has been a pleasure working with you." The words were sincere, she realized. For all his fussiness, Carlo had always been fair to her, had recognized her hard work even if he couldn't pay her what she deserved. She gave him a small smile. "Thank you, Carlo, for everything." As they walked through the restaurant toward the exit, Maya was aware of every eye on them, of the whispered conversations that followed in their wake like a tide. Tomorrow she'd be the subject of gossip and speculation. Tomorrow her face might be splashed across social media, another poor girl who'd snagged a billionaire, another Cinderella story that people would dissect and debate. But tonight, as Adrian's hand rested gently on the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd with quiet authority, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She allowed herself to feel hope. Outside, the city night was cool and clear, the kind of evening where possibilities felt infinite. A sleek black car was waiting at the curb, a driver standing at attention beside the open rear door. Adrian gestured for her to get in, and as she slid onto the leather seats that probably cost more than her entire apartment, she thought about the surreal trajectory of her evening. She'd arrived at work expecting just another shift, another night of aching feet and forced smiles. She was leaving as the pregnant partner of one of the world's wealthiest men, with a townhouse waiting for her and a future that looked nothing like the one she'd imagined when she woke up that morning. Adrian settled in beside her, and as the car pulled smoothly into traffic, he turned to her with an expression that was both serious and oddly tender. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," he said. "Your ex-husband may be temporarily embarrassed, but men like Marcus Torres don't give up easily, especially not when their pride has been wounded. We need to be prepared for him to fight back." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you think he'll do?" Adrian's jaw tightened, and in the dim light of the car's interior, his face looked harder, more dangerous. "I think he'll do exactly what wounded men always do. He'll try to prove that he's still relevant, still powerful, still in control. And that he said, meeting her eyes with an intensity that was both reassuring and frightening as when things are going to get complicated. The townhouse in Riverside Heights was not just a home, it was a statement, a fortress disguised as elegance, a place where old money whispered secrets behind ivy-covered walls and security cameras hidden in decorative sconces. When the car pulled up to the address Adrian had given the driver, Maya pressed her face against the window like a child seeing something magical for the first time. The building was 3 stories of cream-colored brick with black shutters and window, boxes that would bloom with flowers in spring. A small private garden was visible through a wrought iron gate, and the front door was painted a deep forest green with brass fixtures that gleamed even in the streetlight. "This is mine?" she whispered, unable to believe that a place like this, a place that belonged in magazines and daydreams, could ever be associated with someone like her. Adrian stepped out of the car and came around to open her door, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that made her feel simultaneously cared for and completely out of her depth. "It's yours," he confirmed, pulling a set of keys from his pocket and placing them in her hand. The metal was warm from his touch. "For as long as you need it. Forever, if that's what you choose." He led her up the stone steps, and as he unlocked the door, Maya felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She was about to step into a new life, a life she hadn't earned or planned for, a life that had been gifted to her by a stranger's inexplicable kindness. The door swung open, and warm light spilled out into the night. Adrian stepped aside, letting her enter first, and as she crossed the threshold, Maya felt like she was stepping through a portal into an alternate universe. The interior was breathtaking. The entryway opened into a living room with hardwood floors that gleamed like honey, furniture in soft grays and creams that looked expensive but somehow still inviting, and a fireplace with a marble mantel that would have fit perfectly in a period drama. There were bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, artwork on the walls that looked original, and lighting fixtures that cast everything in a warm golden glow. To her left, she could see a kitchen through an archway, all white marble countertops and stainless steel appliances that probably cost more than her car. A staircase with a polished wooden banister curved up to the second floor, promising more wonders above. Maya stood in the center of the living room, turning in a slow circle, trying to absorb the reality of what she was seeing. "Can't believe this is real," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I keep waiting to wake up." Adrian closed the door behind them and moved into the room with the ease of someone comfortable in any environment. "It's real," he assured her, "and it's only the beginning. Come, let me show you the rest." He guided her through the townhouse, and each room was more beautiful than the last. The kitchen had everything a person could need, the cabinets already stocked with dishes and cookware that looked like it had never been used. The dining room could seat 8 comfortably. There was a study with a desk and a window overlooking the garden, a powder room with fixtures that sparkled, and a laundry room with machines that were definitely not coin-operated. Upstairs there were 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom was enormous, with a king-size bed dressed in white linens, a walk-in closet that was currently empty but waiting to be filled, and an ensuite bathroom with a clawfoot tub that made Maya want to cry with longing. She couldn't remember the last time she'd taken a real bath, had soaked in hot water without worrying about the utility bill or the neighbors pounding on the shared wall. The second bedroom was smaller but still larger than her entire previous apartment. It had been set up as a guest room with a comfortable-looking bed and neutral decor, but it was the third bedroom that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. Adrian opened the door and she stepped into a space that had clearly been prepared with care and intention. The walls were painted a soft, buttery yellow, the kind of color that felt like sunshine even on the grayest day. There was a white crib against one wall, already assembled and made up with a mobile hanging above it that featured little stars and moons. A changing table stood ready with stacks of diapers and supplies. A rocking chair sat near the window, positioned to catch the morning light. Shelves held stuffed animals and baby books, and a soft rug covered the hardwood floor. It was a nursery, a complete, beautiful, ready-to-use nursery for a baby that wouldn't arrive for another 6 months. Maya's hand flew to her mouth, and the tears she'd been holding back all evening finally spilled over. "You did this?" she asked, her voice breaking. "When? How?" Adrian stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, looking almost uncertain for the first time that evening. "I made some calls while we were discussing terms. I have people who can move quickly when properly motivated." He cleared his throat, and Maya realized he was nervous. Actually nervous about her reaction. "If you don't like the color, it can be changed. If you want different furniture, we can replace it. I just thought..." He paused, searching for words. "I wanted you to know that this is real, that I'm serious about being part of this child's life." Maya crossed the room and threw her arms around him, the gesture impulsive and born of pure, overwhelming gratitude. She felt him stiffen in surprise, then slowly his arms came up around her, holding her with a gentleness that contradicted his powerful presence. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for seeing me, for helping me, for making me believe that maybe everything is going to be okay." Adrian held her for a moment longer, then gently pulled back, his hands resting on her shoulders. "You're going to be a wonderful mother, Maya, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you and this baby have everything you need." He glanced at his watch, a subtle movement that reminded her he was still a billionaire with schedules and obligations even at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. I should go, let you rest and process everything. But before I do, there's something you need to know. The seriousness in his tone made her stomach clench with worry. What is it? Marcus called my office while we were driving over here. Apparently he recovered from his fainting spell with remarkable speed and decided to make some threats. Maya's brief moment of peace shattered like glass. What kind of threats? Adrian's expression hardened, his jaw setting in a way that made him look dangerous. He claims he's going to file for an emergency paternity test. He's threatening to go to the press with the story, to paint me as a predator who took advantage of a vulnerable woman. He's already retained a lawyer, though not a very good one, based on the demands they're making. Maya felt the familiar weight of dread settling on her shoulders. This was what she'd been afraid of, what she'd known in her bones would happen. Marcus couldn't stand to lose, couldn't bear the idea of her moving on to something better, especially with someone who made him look small and insignificant by comparison. What are we going to do? She asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Adrian's response was immediate and decisive. We're going to document everything. Tomorrow you're going to meet with my legal team. They'll take your statement about your marriage, the divorce, the timeline of the pregnancy. We'll have medical records that confirm the dates. If Marcus wants to fight, we'll bury him in paperwork and precedent. But more importantly, Adrian continued, his voice softening, you're going to live your life. You're going to rest. Take care of yourself. Prepare for your baby. You're not going to let Marcus Torres steal one more moment of peace from you. That's what he wants, Maya. He wants you afraid, uncertain, doubting yourself. We're not going to give him that satisfaction. The conviction in Adrian's words made her believe for the first time that maybe she really could be free of Marcus's shadow. But there was still a question nagging at her, one she'd been too overwhelmed to ask until now. Why me? She asked, looking up into those gray eyes that seemed to see everything. You could have anyone. You could have a wife, traditional family, all the things that people like you are supposed to have. Why choose this? Why choose me and my complicated mess? Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, looking at something beyond the walls of the nursery. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that matched her own. 5 years ago, he began, I was engaged. Her name was Victoria. She was beautiful, accomplished, from the right family with the right connection. We were supposed to be perfect together. He smiled, but it was bitter. The wedding was planned for the fall. A destination affair in the Amalfi Coast. 300 guests, a designer dress, everything society expected. And then 2 months before the ceremony, I found out she was pregnant. Maya's eyes widened. What happened? Adrian's expression was unreadable. The baby wasn't mine. She'd been having an affair with my business partner, a man I'd known since college, someone I trusted. When I confronted her, she didn't even have the decency to deny it. She said it was a mistake, that the affair meant nothing, that we could pass the baby off as mine and no one would ever know. She actually seemed surprised when I said no. The betrayal in his story echoed her own, and Maya understood suddenly why he'd stepped in at the restaurant. He knew what it felt like to be discarded, to discover that the person you'd trusted most was a lie. I called off the wedding, Adrian continued. I bought out my partner's shares in the company and cut him out of my life entirely. And Victoria, he paused, she got an abortion. Not because she wanted to, but because without me and my money, she couldn't afford the scandal of being a single mother in her social circle. She terminated the pregnancy a week after I left her. Maya's hand instinctively moved to her stomach, a protective gesture. That's awful, she whispered. He nodded. I've thought about that child every day for 5 years. The one that never got a chance because I wasn't man enough to separate my anger at Victoria from the innocent life she was carrying. I could have helped her. I could have been a father to that baby even if I couldn't be a husband to her. But my pride got in the way, and a child died because of it. His voice broke slightly on the last words, and Maya saw the guilt that had been eating at him for half a decade. When I saw you tonight, Adrian said, meeting her eyes again. When I saw you trying to hide your pregnancy, trying to be strong while your ex-husband paraded his new life in front of you, I saw a chance for redemption. I can't undo what happened with Victoria's baby, but I can make sure your child has everything mine never got. Love, security, a father who chooses to be there. That's why you, Maya, that's why I'm doing this. The rawness of his confession left them both standing in the gentle yellow glow of the nursery. Two wounded people who'd found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances. Maya reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. I'm sorry for what happened to you, she said, and I'm grateful that something so painful led you to help me. But Adrian, you need to know something. This baby, my baby, is going to be loved regardless of who the father is on paper. You're not doing this to make up for a past mistake. You're doing this because you're a good man who saw someone drowning and threw them a lifeline. Adrian looked at their joined hands, and when he lifted his gaze to hers, there was something vulnerable and grateful in his expression. Maybe we're saving each other, he said quietly. Maya nodded. Maybe we are. After Adrian left, promising to send a car for her tomorrow morning to meet with his lawyers, Maya wandered through the townhouse in a daze, ran her fingers along the smooth surfaces, sat on the furniture that didn't sag or creak, stood in the nursery and imagined her child sleeping peacefully in that white crib. It felt like a dream, beautiful and fragile, something that could shatter if she breathed too hard. But when she finally climbed into the enormous bed in the master bedroom, sinking into sheets that felt like clouds, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this dream was real. And for the first time in months, Maya Torres fell asleep without fear gnawing at her chest, without the weight of impossible mathematics crushing her spirit. She fell asleep in safety and comfort, protected by a stranger who'd become something she'd never expected to find again. She fell asleep with hope. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through windows that actually opened properly. In a bedroom where the heating worked and the sounds of the city were muffled by walls thick enough to provide real peace, Maya woke slowly, luxuriously, stretching in the enormous bed before reality crashed back into her conscience. Yesterday had been real. The restaurant confrontation, Adrian's impossible offer, this townhouse that felt like something from another life. She sat up, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach, and whispered to the tiny life growing inside her, "We're going to be okay. I promise we're going to be okay." The conviction in her voice surprised her. For the first time since she'd seen those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test, she actually believed it. The car arrived at 9, just as Adrian had promised. The driver was a man in his 50s named Robert, who treated her with a deference that made her uncomfortable, until she realized this was simply his job. His professional courtesy extended to everyone associated with Adrian Westwood. The drive to downtown took them past her old neighborhood, past the diner where she'd sometimes grab coffee on her way to work, past the laundromat where she'd spent countless hours feeding quarters into machines that barely worked. That life felt impossibly distant now, like something she'd watched in a movie rather than lived herself. Adrian's law offices were located in one of the glass towers that dominated the city skyline. The kind of building she'd walked past 1,000 times without ever imagining she'd have reason to enter. The lobby was all marble and modern art, with a security desk staffed by guards who looked like they could double as Secret Service agents. Robert escorted her to a private elevator that required a key card to access. And as they rose silently toward the 53rd floor, Maya felt her anxiety building with each passing level. The doors opened directly into a reception area that screamed wealth and power in a language of understated elegance. A woman in her 30s with perfect posture and a smile that managed to be both professional and genuinely warm stood up from behind. A desk made of what looked like a single piece of polished stone. "Miss Torres. Welcome. I'm Sarah Chun, Mr. Westwood's executive assistant. He's waiting for you in the conference room. Please follow me." Sarah led her down a hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of the city that made Maya feel like she was walking through the sky. They passed offices where serious-looking people worked behind glass walls, and Maya caught glimpses of the machinery of Adrian's empire. The lawyers and analysts and executives who kept billions of dollars moving through the global economy. Finally, they reached a conference room dominated by a table long enough to seat 20 people. Adrian stood at the far end talking to 3 other people, a woman in a sharp navy suit, a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses and an iPad, and an older gentleman with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms. "Maya," Adrian said, and the warmth in his voice immediately put her at ease. He crossed the room to greet her, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder in a gesture of reassurance. "Thank you for coming. I know this is overwhelming, but these people are the best at what they do, and they're going to make sure you're protected." He introduced them one by one. The woman in navy was Catherine Morrison, one of the city's top family law attorneys with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in defense of her clients. The young man was David Chun, a paralegal who would be documenting everything. And the older gentleman was Harrison Blackwell, a litigator whose name even Maya had heard before, usually in connection with high-profile cases that ended with his opponents thoroughly defeated. They were an army, and they were hers. The realization was both empowering and terrifying. "Please sit," Catherine said, gesturing to a chair. "Over the next few hours, we're going to walk through everything. Your marriage to Marcus Torres, the divorce, the timeline of your pregnancy, your current situation. I know it's intrusive, I know it's uncomfortable, but we need every detail if we're going to build an impenetrable case." Maya sank into the leather chair, and Adrian took the seat beside her, close enough that she could feel his presence like an anchor in a storm. She'd expected him to leave, to hand her off to his lawyers and return to whatever important business Billionaires conducted. But he stayed. And somehow that made everything easier. For the next 3 hours, Maya told her story. She told him about meeting Marcus in college, about how charming he'd been, how he'd made her feel like she was the center of his universe right until the moment she wasn't. She told them about the slow erosion of their marriage, how he'd become distant and critical, how he'd made her feel small and insufficient. She told them about Jennifer, about discovering the affair when she'd come home early from a catering job and found them together in the apartment she'd been paying for with double shifts and skipped meals. Catherine took notes with the precision of a surgeon, occasionally asking clarifying questions that made Maya realize just how carefully they were building her defense. "What was the exact date you discovered the affair? Did Marcus ever contribute financially to the household after the first year of marriage? Were there witnesses to his behavior toward you?" Each question was a brick in a wall they were constructing around her, a fortress of facts and documentation that would protect her from whatever Marcus tried to throw at them. Then they moved on to the pregnancy. Maya explained that she'd been seeing someone briefly after the divorce was finalized, a kind man named Daniel who worked at the library near her apartment. They'd dated for 6 weeks, sleeping together exactly 3 times before he'd accepted a job in Seattle and moved away. They'd parted on good good terms with promises to stay in touch that had faded into the occasional text message. He didn't know about the pregnancy. She hadn't told him because by the time she'd confirmed it, he was already building a new life 3,000 miles away, and she couldn't bring herself to derail his happiness with her reality. Would you be willing to contact Daniel and inform him of the situation? Catherine asked, her tone carefully neutral. If Marcus pursues paternity testing, having Daniel's voluntary acknowledgement that he could be the father would strengthen your position significantly. Maya felt Adrian tense beside her, and she glanced at him, seeing something complicated flash across his face. Jealousy? Concern? She couldn't quite read it. I'll reach out to him, she said quietly. He deserves to know the truth. Even if I don't expect anything from him, he should be informed. Adrian's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently, and she understood the gesture. He was acknowledging her integrity even as it complicated their carefully constructed narrative after they'd documented every detail of her story. Harrison Blackwell leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. Mr. Torres has retained counsel, as you know. His attorney is Marcus Webb, a mid-tier family lawyer with a reputation for being aggressive but not particularly strategic. They've already filed preliminary papers requesting a court-ordered paternity test. What are our chances of blocking it? Adrian asked, his voice tight. Harrison exchanged a glance with Catherine before responding. Slim to none. The court will almost certainly grant the request. Miss Torres has a reasonable claim that he could be the biological father, given the timeline of your divorce and Miss Torres's pregnancy. Attempting to block the test would make us look like we're hiding something. Maya felt her stomach drop. So Marcus is going to find out the baby isn't his. And then what? Then Catherine said, her smile sharp as a blade. We pivot. The moment that test comes back excluding Marcus Torres as the father, we file a restraining order based on harassment. We document every threatening phone call, every social media post, every attempt he makes to insert himself into your life. We paint a picture of an obsessed ex-husband who can't accept that you've moved on, and we make it very, very clear that Adrian Westwood is this child's father in every way that matters, legally and otherwise. Adrian can formally adopt the baby after birth, David added, looking up from his iPad. With Miss Torres's consent and the biological father's consent, if we can obtain it, the adoption would give Mr. Westwood full parental rights. The baby's birth certificate would list him as the father. Marcus Torres would have absolutely no legal standing. The machinery of the law was clicking into place around Maya, protective and powerful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all dancing around a fundamental truth. What if Daniel wants to be involved? She asked quietly. What if I tell him about the baby and he decides he wants to be a father? The room fell silent. It was Adrian who answered, his voice carefully controlled. Then we deal with that when it happens. You're not going to lie to him, Maya. That's not who you are, and I won't ask you to compromise your integrity to make my life easier. If Daniel wants to be part of this child's life, we'll find a way to make it work. The generosity of his response, the willingness to potentially share or even step aside, made Maya's throat tight with emotion. But Catherine, ever the pragmatist, pressed on. For now, she said, let's focus on Marcus Torres. He's the immediate threat. I've already started compiling his social media activity, and Miss Torres, I have to warn you, some of it is concerning. She pulled up her laptop and turned the screen so Maya could see. There, on Marcus's Facebook page, was a post from last night, time-stamped just 3 hours after his collapse at Luminar. The text made Maya's blood run cold. Sometimes the woman you loved turns out to be someone you never really knew. When money and power corrupt a good person, all you can do is fight for what's right. I will fight for my child. The comments below were a mixture of support and speculation. Friends offering encouragement while strangers theorized about what had happened. Someone had already posted a blurry photo from the restaurant showing Maya and Adrian standing together, her hand on his arm. The caption read, "This is the billionaire who thinks he can buy anything, even another man's child." They're already building a narrative, Harrison said grimly. Marcus is positioning himself as the wronged husband, the abandoned father fighting against a rich predator who's taken advantage of his vulnerable ex-wife. It's effective because it plays into existing social narratives about wealth and power. Adrian's expression was granite. Then we build our own narrative. Sarah, he said, and his assistant appeared so quickly she must have been waiting just outside. Get me Patricia Vance at the Chronicle. Tell her I'm ready to give her that exclusive interview she's been requesting. But I'm doing it on my terms, and the story is about my commitment to family and second chance. Patricia Vance was the city's most respected journalist, known for her tough but fair reporting. If Adrian was willing to give her access to this story, he was playing a very high-stakes game. Catherine nodded approval. Good call. We control the narrative before Marcus can poison it further. And Ms. Torres, you're going to need to be prepared. Once Adrian goes public with his version of events, the media attention is going to be intense. Are you ready for that? Maya thought about the small, quiet life she'd lived until yesterday. She thought about her preference for invisibility, her careful construction of walls between herself and the world's judgment. And then she thought about her child, about the future she wanted to build, about the man sitting beside her who'd offered her everything without asking for anything but a chance to be part of something real. I'm ready, she said, and she meant it. The rest of the meeting covered logistics, security protocols that would protect her from unwanted media attention, and a timeline for the legal proceedings that would likely unfold over the coming months. By the time they finished, it was early afternoon, and Maya felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. and everything to do with the emotional weight of reliving her past and preparing for the battle ahead. Adrian walked her to the elevator, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "You did well today," he said as they waited for the doors to open. "I know that couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Maya admitted, "but it was necessary." She turned to face him, studying the strong lines of his face, the gray eyes that seemed to see everything. "Adrian, are you sure about this? About giving the interview, about making our arrangement public? Once you do this, there's no taking it back. You'll be tied to me and my mess forever." He smiled, and it transformed his usually serious expression into something warmer, more human. "Maya, I've spent 20 years building an empire in private, keeping my personal life behind walls so high that I forgot what it felt like to connect with another human being. This," he gestured between you, your child, this chance to be part of something real. "It's the first time in a decade I've felt truly alive, so yes, I'm sure. More sure than I've been about anything in a very long time." The elevator doors opened, and before she stepped inside, Maya rose on her toes and kissed his cheek, a gesture of gratitude and affection that surprised them both. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." As the doors closed and the elevator began its descent, Maya touched her fingers to her lips, feeling the ghost of the connection they'd just shared, and she realized with a mixture of terror and excitement that she was starting to care about Adrian Westwood as more than just her improbable savior. She was starting to care about him as a man. Patricia Vance arrived at the townhouse 3 days later with a photographer, a digital recorder, and a reputation for making powerful men squirm. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind stylish frames and a no-nonsense demeanor that made it clear she hadn't gotten to the top of her profession by being easily charmed or manipulated. Adrian had insisted the interview take place at Maya's home rather than his office. A strategic choice that would present them as a couple, building a life together rather than a billionaire conducting a transaction. Maya had spent the morning in a state of controlled panic, changing outfits 4 times before settling on a simple navy dress that accommodated her growing bump without advertising it, applying makeup with trembling hands while fighting waves of nausea that had nothing to do with morning sickness and everything to do with terror about being thrust into the public eye. When Patricia settled into the armchair across from the sofa where Maya and Adrian sat, her gaze moved between them with the calculating assessment of someone trained to spot lies and inconsistency. She placed her recorder on the coffee table, and Maya watched the red light blink on with the feeling that she was about to step off a cliff. "Miss Wood, Ms. Torres, thank you for agreeing to this interview. I understand there's been quite a bit of speculation about your relationship following the incident at Luminar last. Perhaps we could start with you telling me in your own words what happened that evening." Adrian's hand found Maya's, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that felt both performative and genuine. "What happened," he began, his voice steady and clear, "was that I witnessed a woman being confronted by her ex-husband in a vulnerable moment, and I made a choice to offer her protection and support. Ms. Torres and I had never met before that evening. I was simply a customer at the restaurant where she worked, but when I saw her dignity under pressure, her courage in the face of someone trying to diminish her, I recognized something rare and valuable." Patricia's pen moved across her notepad with sharp efficiency. "And the pregnancy, Mr. Westwood? You claim the child is yours in front of a room full of witnesses. That's quite an extraordinary gesture for someone you'd just met." "It is extraordinary," Adrian agreed. "But so are the circumstances. Miss Torres is carrying a child conceived after her divorce from Marcus Torres was finalized. The biological father is not Miss Torres, despite his claims to the contrary. I offered to be this child's father because I have the resources to provide security and stability, and because I believe every child deserves to be wanted, protected, and loved regardless of the circumstances of their conception." Patricia turned her sharp gaze to Maya. "Miss Torres, some people might see this as a Cinderella story, a struggling waitress swept off her feet by a billionaire. Others might see it as opportunistic. What would you say to those critics?" Maya had prepared for this question with Catherine's help, but actually answering it while being recorded felt entirely different. She took a breath and spoke from the heart. "I'd say they're entitled to their opinions, but they don't know my story. They don't know what it's like to work double shifts while pregnant, to calculate whether you can afford prenatal vitamins or whether the electricity bill is more important. They don't know what it's like to face single motherhood with no safety net, no family support, and an ex-husband who abandoned you but suddenly reappears when someone else offers to help." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Adrian didn't sweep me off my feet. He offered me a choice I didn't have before. He offered my child a future that doesn't involve poverty and fear. If people want to judge that, they can, but they should ask themselves what they would do in my position." Patricia leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "And what about Marcus Torres? He's been vocal on social media about his belief that this child might be his, that you're being manipulated by Mr. Westwood's wealth and influence. How do you respond to that?" "Marcus had his chance to be a husband and a partner," Maya said, and the steel in her voice surprised even herself. "He chose to have an affair, to abandon our marriage, and to leave me with nothing but his debts and broken promises. He didn't want me when I was his wife. He doesn't get to claim my child now that someone else is willing to step up." Adrian squeezed her hand, a silent gesture of support that the photographer captured in a moment that would become the defining image of the article. The interview continued for another hour, covering Adrian's background, his previous engagement, and the painful loss that had motivated his offer, and their plans for the future. Patricia was thorough, asking uncomfortable questions about prenatal care, legal arrangements, and how they planned to navigate a relationship that had started under such unusual circumstances. But she was also fair, and by the end of the interview, Maya could see a grudging respect in her eyes. She might not have been convinced of their fairy tale, but she recognized the authenticity of their mutual need and the genuine care that was developing between them. After Patricia and her photographer left, Maya collapsed onto the sofa with a shaky laugh. Is it always this exhausting, being in the public eye? Adrian loosened his tie and sat beside her, his own relief visible. Usually it's worse. You handled yourself beautifully. When the article came out 2 days later, it dominated the news cycle. The headline read, "Billionaire's Second Chance. Adrian Westwood opens up about love, loss, and an unexpected family." The accompanying photo showed Maya and Adrian on the sofa, their hands clasped together, her small baby bump visible beneath her dress, his expression protective and tender. The article itself was balanced, presenting their story with both skepticism and compassion, acknowledging the unusual circumstances while highlighting the genuine emotion in their words. Patricia had done her research, including details about Marcus's affair, his financial situation, and his sudden interest in a child he'd never wanted. She'd also dug into Adrian's past, confirming the story about Victoria and the terminated pregnancy, adding context that made his offer seem less like charity and more like redemption. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Social media exploded with hot takes, think pieces, and endless speculation. Some people saw romance and second chances. Others saw manipulation and wealth inequality. Feminist writers debated whether Maya was empowered or exploited. Financial analysts questioned Adrian's judgment in mixing personal and public life. And through it all, Marcus Torres became increasingly unhinged in his response. He went on local news shows claiming parental rights he'd never wanted. He hired a public relations consultant who coached him to present himself as a wronged father fighting a corrupt system. He posted constantly on social media, each message more desperate and angry than the last. The attention was overwhelming, but Catherine and Harrison moved quickly to counter every claim. They released carefully worded statements, filed legal motions, and built an ironclad case that Marcus Torres had no legitimate claim to Maya's child. And then, 3 weeks after the interview was published, Maya finally worked up the courage to contact Daniel. She'd been putting it off, dreading the conversation, knowing that it could append everything Adrian had built for her. But her conscience wouldn't let her hide the truth any longer. She sent him an email, simple and direct, explaining the pregnancy, the timing, and the situation with Adrian. She didn't ask for anything. She simply offered him the truth and the choice of what to do with it. Daniel's response came within hours, and it was so characteristically kind that it made Maya cry. He wrote that he was happy for her, that he'd always known their relationship was temporary, and that he had no desire to complicate her life. He acknowledged that he could be the biological father, but he also recognized that biology didn't make someone a parent. Adrian was being a father in all the ways that mattered, and Daniel respected that. He offered to provide DNA if needed for medical purposes, but otherwise he wished her well and asked only that she'd send him a photo when the baby was born. The relief Maya felt was profound, but so was the guilt. Daniel deserved better than an email explaining he might be a father, but he'd given her grace and she accepted it with gratitude. She showed Adrian the email that evening over dinner, a meal they'd started sharing regularly as their arrangement evolved into something that felt increasingly like a real relationship. He read it silently, his expression unreadable, then looked up at her with something like awe in his eyes. "He's a good man," Adrian said quietly. "Yes," Maya agreed. "He is. But he's not you." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that neither was quite ready to fully explore. Their relationship existed in a strange liminal space. More than a business arrangement, but not quite a romance. Built on mutual need, but growing into genuine affection. They were learning each other slowly, carefully. Two damaged people afraid to trust, but desperate for connection. Adrian came to her prenatal appointments, sitting beside her while the doctor measured her blood pressure and checked the baby's heartbeat. The first time they heard that rapid flutter of sound, that proof of life growing inside her, Adrian's hand tightened on hers and she saw tears in his eyes that he quickly blinked away. They spent evenings talking, sharing stories from their pasts, building the foundation of understanding that real relationships required. Maya learned that Adrian played piano beautifully but rarely allowed himself the time, that he'd wanted to be an architect but had been pushed into business by his father's expectations, that he loved old movies and terrible puns and had a sweet tooth he indulged in secret. Adrian learned that Maya had a degree in literature she'd never used, that she wrote poetry in a journal she kept hidden, that she missed her mother who had died when Maya was 19, leaving her alone in a world that felt too hard and too cold. They were building something real, something that transcended the transactional origins of their arrangement. But the shadow of Marcus Torres loomed over everything, a constant reminder that their peace was fragile and temporary. The paternity test was scheduled for Maya's 20th week of pregnancy. The court had granted Marcus's request, and despite Catherine's brilliant legal maneuvering, there was no avoiding it. The test itself was simple, a blood draw that took 5 minutes but felt like stepping into a crucible. Maya sat in the medical office with Adrian beside her, holding her hand while the technician drew vials of blood that would be analyzed and compared to samples Marcus had already provided. The results would take 2 weeks. 2 weeks of waiting and wondering and preparing for whatever came next. As they left the medical office, Maya felt Adrian's tension in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the careful control of his expression. He was afraid, she realized. Afraid that the test would confirm Marcus as the father, that all his plans and promises would crumble, that he'd lose the chance to be a parent just as he'd lost it 5 years ago. She stopped on the sidewalk, pulling him to face her, her hands framing his face in a gesture of intimacy that had become natural between them. No matter what that test says, she told him, her voice fierce with conviction. You are this baby's father. You're the one who's been here. You're the one who's preparing a nursery and coming to appointments and making sure we're safe. Biology doesn't make family, Adrian. Love does. Choice does. And you've chosen us. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, his face buried in her hair, and she felt him shake with the emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for letting me be part of this. They stood there on the busy sidewalk, two people clinging to each other against the uncertainty of the future, and Maya knew that whatever the test results revealed, whatever battles still lay ahead, they would face them together. The 2 weeks waiting for the paternity test results felt like living in suspended animation. Maya went through the motions of daily life, settling into the rhythms of the townhouse, attending yoga classes for pregnant women that Adrian had enrolled her in, reading books about childbirth and infant care that appeared mysteriously on her nightstand. But underneath the surface, calm was a current of anxiety that never quite disappeared. A constant awareness that everything she'd built could collapse with a single phone call. Adrian threw himself into work with an intensity that worried her, spending long hours at the office as if staying busy could somehow influence the outcome of a test already completed. But he still came home every evening, still joined her for dinner, still sat with her in the nursery while they discussed names and futures and all the small hopes that felt both precious and fragile. Marcus, meanwhile, was everywhere. He'd become a fixture on local news programs, giving interviews where he painted himself as a father fighting for his rights against a corrupt system designed to favor the wealthy. He'd found allies in men's rights groups who saw his case as emblematic of larger injustices. His social media following had exploded, thousands of people who'd never met him rallying to his cause, donating to his legal fund, sharing his posts with righteous anger. The narrative he'd constructed was compelling because it contained just enough truth to be believable. He was the working class man standing up to a billionaire. He was the father denied access to his child. He was the victim of a woman who'd moved on too quickly, who'd chosen money over integrity. The fact that none of it was quite accurate didn't seem to matter to the growing chorus of supporters who'd turned him into a symbol of something larger than himself. Catherine kept Maya insulated from the worst of it, but she couldn't block out everything. Maya saw the protesters outside Adrian's office building, a small but vocal group carrying signs that read, "Fatherhood isn't for sale and money can't buy parenthood." She saw the think pieces debating whether Adrian's arrangement with her was ethical or exploitative. She saw the cruel memes and the vicious comments from strangers who decided she was either a gold digger or a victim, with no room for the complicated truth that lay between those extremes. The pressure was crushing, and there were nights when Maya lay awake wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake, if she should have just struggled through on her own rather than exposing herself and her unborn child to this circus of judgment and speculation. But then Adrian would text her goodnight from wherever he was working, or she'd wake to find him asleep in the chair in her bedroom where he'd been reading to her baby bump, and she'd remember why she'd said yes, because this man, this complicated, lonely billionaire, had chosen to be present when no one else had. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Maya was eating breakfast in the kitchen, trying to keep down scrambled eggs that her pregnancy-sensitive stomach was protesting. Her phone rang with Catherine's number, and Maya's hand trembled so badly she nearly dropped it. This is it, she thought. This is the moment everything changes. She answered on the second ring, and Catherine's voice was crisp and professional, but Maya could hear the satisfaction underneath. "The results are in," she said. "Marcus Torres is excluded as the biological father. The probability of paternity is 0%. Maya's legs gave out, and she sank into the nearest chair, tears streaming down her face. "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure," Catherine replied. "I have the official report right here. Marcus Torres has no biological connection to your child, none whatsoever. Which means," she continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, "we can now move forward with the restraining order. His claim of parental interest is officially groundless. He has no legal standing to insert himself into your life, and if he continues to harass you, he'll face consequences." Maya called Adrian immediately, her fingers shaking as she dialed. He answered on the first ring as if he'd been waiting by the phone. "The baby's not his," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "Marcus isn't the father." The silence on the other end of the line lasted just long enough for Maya to worry, and then Adrian's voice came through, thick with emotion. "I'm coming home. Stay there. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He made it in 15, bursting through the front door with an urgency that made her heart race. She stood from where she'd been sitting at the kitchen table, and he crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms with a force that spoke of all the fear he'd been holding back for 2 weeks. "It's over," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "That part is over." They stood there holding each other, and Maya felt something shift between them, some final barrier crumbling. This wasn't about convenience anymore. This wasn't about a transaction or a mutually beneficial arrangement. This was about two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of their separate lives and built something that felt remarkably like love. The official notification of the test results was delivered to Marcus Torres later that day, and his response was immediate and explosive. Within hours, he'd posted a long, rambling message on social media claiming the test had been tampered with, that Adrian Westwood's money and influence had corrupted the process, that this was proof of how the system protected the rich while crushing ordinary men like him. The post was incoherent in places, his rage and humiliation bleeding through every poorly punctuated sentence. He called for investigations, demanded independent verification, threatened lawsuits that his followers eagerly encouraged despite their complete lack of legal merit. Catherine and Harrison moved quickly, filing for the restraining order and releasing a carefully worded statement confirming the test results and announcing that Marcus Torres was legally barred from any further contact with Maya or any public statements about her or her pregnancy. The statement was professional and final, a door slamming shut on Marcus's desperate attempts to remain relevant to a story that had never really been his. But Marcus wasn't done. 2 days after the results were made public, Maya was leaving a prenatal appointment when she saw him. He was standing across the street from the medical building, no longer dressed in the expensive suits he'd worn for his media appearances, but back in his normal clothes, looking rumpled and desperate. Their eyes met, and Maya felt ice flood her veins. She pulled out her phone, ready to call security, but he made no move toward her. He just stood there, staring, and the look on his face was so full of rage and loss that it frightened her more than any direct threat could have. Adrian's driver, Robert, immediately positioned himself between Maya and Marcus, ushering her into the car with practiced efficiency. As they pulled away, Maya watched Marcus through the rear window, seeing him standing alone on that busy sidewalk, a man who'd gambled everything on a lie and lost. She should have felt triumphant. She should have felt vindicated. Instead, she just felt sad. Sad for the person she'd once loved enough to marry. Sad for the way his pride and jealousy had destroyed him. Sad for the future they might have had if he'd been a different kind of man. That evening, Adrian found her in the nursery, sitting in the rocking chair and staring at nothing. He'd come straight from the office, still in his suit, and he knelt beside the chair, taking her hands in his. "Talk to me," he said gently. "Tell me what you're feeling." Maya looked at him, at the concern in his gray eyes, at the man who'd become so much more than her unlikely savior. "I saw Marcus today," she admitted, "outside the doctor's office. He was just standing there watching me, and I know I should be happy that it's over, that the test proved he has no claim, but Adrian, he looked so broken. Like he'd lost everything. And maybe he's a terrible person who deserves to lose everything, but he wasn't always terrible. There was a time when I loved him, when I thought we'd build a life together. Seeing him like that, it just makes me sad." Adrian's expression was understanding, and he reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. "That's because you're a good person, Maya. You have empathy even for someone who hurt you. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." He stood, pulling her gently to her feet, and led her out of the nursery and down to the living room. They sat together on the sofa, and Adrian wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "Marcus made his choices," he said quietly. "He chose to have an affair. He chose to abandon you. He chose to try to insert himself back into your life, not because he loved you or wanted to be a father, but because his ego couldn't handle seeing you move on to something better. You don't owe him your guilt or your pity." Maya leaned into his warmth, letting his words wash over her. "You're right," she said. "I know you're right, but it's still hard." Adrian pressed a kiss to the top of her head, a gesture that had become familiar between them, intimate without being presumptuous. "I know it is, but here's what I want you to focus on. In 4 months, you're going to have a baby, our baby, and that child is going to be loved and protected and given every opportunity to thrive. That's what matters. Not Marcus's wounded pride or his desperate attempts to rewrite history, just our family and our future. Our family." The words settled over Maya like a warm blanket, and she realized that sometime in the past 6 weeks, that's what they'd become. Not a billionaire and the waitress he'd rescued, not a convenient arrangement or a transaction, but a family, chosen and built from broken pieces. Imperfect but real. She turned to face Adrian, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek, and she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. "When did this happen?" she asked softly. "When did we stop pretending this was just about helping each other?" He covered her hand with his, holding it against his face. "I think it happened the moment I saw you in that restaurant," he admitted. "I told myself I was being noble, being generous, but the truth is I was drawn to you from the first moment. Your strength, your dignity, the way you refused to be diminished by your circumstances. I offered to be your baby's father because I could, but I stayed wanted. Because being with you makes me feel like the person I always wanted to be." Maya's heart was pounding, and she knew they were standing at a precipice, about to cross a line from which there was no return. "And now?" she whispered. "What do you want now?" Adrian leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm on her lips. "Now," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I want to be more than just the man helping you. I want to be your partner, your equal. I want to build a real life with you, not because circumstances pushed us together, but because I'm falling in love with Maya. And I hope you might be falling in love with me too." The confession hung between them, vulnerable and true, and Maya felt her own defenses crumble completely. She closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was both an answer and a promise. It was gentle and sweet, full of all the things they'd been too afraid to say, all the feelings they'd been holding back. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Maya rested her hand on her growing belly and smiled through happy tears. I am, she said. I'm falling in love with you, and I think our baby is incredibly lucky to have you as a father. Adrian's answering smile was brilliant, transforming his usually serious face into something joyful and young. As he pulled her close and kissed her again, Maya felt the last of her fear dissolve, replaced by hope. Love, when it finally arrived without pretense or condition, changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Maya and Adrian had been building toward this moment for weeks, circling each other like planets caught in gravitational pull, inevitable but cautious. Now that they'd crossed that threshold, now that the words had been spoken, and the kiss had sealed what they both felt, the world seemed both brighter and more precarious. They were no longer hiding behind the convenient fiction of a transactional arrangement. They were a couple, genuinely and completely, with all the vulnerability and risk that entailed. Adrian became a constant presence in the townhouse, no longer leaving each evening to return to his sterile penthouse apartment. He moved in gradually, casually, a few suits appearing in the master bedroom closet, his laptop finding a permanent home on the desk in the study, his coffee mug claiming a spot in the kitchen cabinet. They fell into domestic rhythms that felt both new and ancient, as if they'd been doing this forever. Maya watched him work from home some afternoons, his brow furrowed in concentration as he reviewed contracts and made decisions that affected thousands of employees. She loved seeing this side of him, the brilliant strategist who'd built an empire from algorithms and ambition. But she loved even more the moments when he'd look up from his work, catch her watching, and smile with a warmth that transformed his entire face. They cooked together in the evenings, Adrian proving surprisingly competent in the kitchen despite having spent years with personal chefs. He made her laugh with terrible jokes and off-key singing while chopping vegetables. He rubbed her feet when they swelled, read pregnancy books cover to cover, and attended every single doctor's appointment with the dedication of someone for whom this child was the most important thing in the world. At 24 weeks, they learned the baby was a girl, and Adrian cried openly in the examination room, holding Maya's hand while the ultrasound technician pointed out their daughter's perfect tiny features on the grainy black and white screen. The public reaction to their evolving relationship was mixed but gradually shifting. Trisha Vance had written a follow-up piece, having noticed the change in their dynamic during a chance encounter at a charity gala. Her article was titled, "From Arrangement to Authentic: The Unexpected Love Story of Adrian Westwood and Maya Torres." She wrote with her characteristic skepticism, but also with a grudging acknowledgement that what had started as an unusual agreement had blossomed into something that appeared genuine. The photographs from the gala showed Maya in a stunning maternity gown, her baby bump prominent and beautiful, with Adrian's hand resting protectively on her lower back, and his gaze fixed on her with unmistakable adoration. The body language didn't lie. These weren't two people playing roles. They were two people genuinely in love. Social media slowly warmed to them, the tide of public opinion turning as people watched their story unfold. There were still critics, still people who questioned their motives or predicted disaster, but increasingly they were drowned out by supporters who saw in Maya and Adrian's story something hopeful, a reminder that love could emerge from the unlikeless circumstances, that broken people could find healing in each other. Marcus Torres, however, was not among those who'd made peace with the situation. The restraining order hadn't silenced him. It had only redirected his rage into channels that skirted the edges of legality. He couldn't contact Maya directly, couldn't post about her specifically on social media, but he found ways around the restrictions. He gave interviews to podcasters and YouTube channels that catered to audiences already predisposed to see wealthy men as villains. He spoke in coded language about corruption and manipulation, about systems rigged against ordinary men. He built a following of angry, disenfranchised people who saw him as a martyr to their various causes. His lawyer, the mediocre Marcus Webb, had been replaced by someone more aggressive, a woman named Rachel Devine, who specialized in high-conflict cases and had a reputation for scorched earth tactics. She'd found a new angle of attack, filing a civil suit against Adrian for alienation of affection, claiming that Adrian had deliberately interfered in Marcus and Maya's marriage for his own gain. Catherine dismissed the lawsuit as frivolous, a desperate attempt to extort a settlement, but it still meant more legal proceedings, more deposition, more energy diverted to defending against Marcus's relentless attempts to stay relevant to their lives. The stress of it wore on Maya despite Adrian's best efforts to shield her. She was in her third trimester now, her body heavy with pregnancy, her emotions volatile and intense. There were nights when she woke from nightmares about Marcus somehow taking their daughter, about courts deciding that biology mattered more than love, about everything they'd built collapsing because the law couldn't understand what they had. Adrian would hold her through those dark hours, whispering reassurances, reminding her that they had the best lawyers money could buy, that Marcus had no legal ground to stand on, that their daughter was safe and loved in theirs. But Maya could see the toll it took on him too, the way his jaw tightened when Catherine called with updates about Marcus's latest maneuver, the tension he carried in his shoulders that no amount of massage could fully release. Then, 6 weeks before Maya's due date, Marcus made his biggest mistake. He showed up at the townhouse. The security system alerted them immediately, cameras catching him approaching the front gate at 3 in the morning. He wasn't wasn't alone. He'd brought two men with cameras, clearly journalists or amateur documentarians who'd bought into his narrative. The footage they captured before private security arrived and escorted them away showed Marcus pleading into the camera, his voice slurred and his words rambling. He spoke about his rights as a potential father, about how the system had failed him, about how love couldn't be bought no matter how many billions someone had. He was drunk or high or both, his desperation and instability evident in every frame. The video went viral within hours, posted to multiple platforms by the men who'd accompanied him. But instead of generating sympathy for Marcus, it had the opposite effect. People saw a man violating a restraining order at 3 in the morning, clearly intoxicated, trying to force his way into the home of his pregnant ex-wife. They saw the unhinged rant of someone who'd lost all sense of proportion and reality. The video became Marcus's undoing. His remaining supporters largely abandoned him, recognizing that this wasn't a man fighting for his rights, but someone who'd become dangerous in his obsession. Rachel Devine, his lawyer, withdrew from his case, citing irreconcilable differences but clearly unwilling to be associated with such spectacular self-sabotage. Marcus was arrested for violating the restraining order, held overnight in jail, and released on bail with even stricter conditions. He was ordered to stay at least 500 feet from Maya, Adrian, or any property associated with them. He was forbidden from posting about them online or giving interviews that mentioned them by name. He was required to attend counseling and submit to random drug testing. The judge had been harsh, clearly fed up with Marcus's escalating behavior, and the terms of his release essentially muzzled him completely. For the first time in months, Maya felt like she could breathe. The constant pressure of Marcus's presence in their lives, the shadow he'd cast over every happy moment, finally lifted. Catherine confirmed that the civil suit would be dismissed, that Marcus had no credible legal standing left, that this nightmare was truly over. Adrian held a small private celebration in the townhouse. Just the two of them and a few close friends he'd slowly introduced Maya to over the past months. His business partner and best friend James Chun, a brilliant engineer who ran the technical side of Adrian's company, toasted them with champagne that Maya couldn't drink but appreciated nonetheless. His sister Caroline, who lived across the country but had flown in for the occasion, hugged Maya tightly and whispered that she'd never seen her brother this happy, this human, this alive. Sarah Chun, Adrian's executive assistant who'd become something of a friend to Maya, brought a beautiful handmade quilt for the baby, each square embroidered with different symbols of love and protection. It was the kind of evening Maya had always imagined having but never thought she'd actually experience. Surrounded by people who cared about her, celebrating not just the victory over Marcus, but the life they were building together. As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Adrian and Maya stood together in the nursery, his arms wrapped around her from behind, his hands resting on her belly where their daughter kicked and rolled. "She's gonna be here so soon," Maya said, wonder and fear mingling in her voice. "Are we ready? Are we really ready for this?" Adrian turned her gently to face him, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "No one is ever really ready," he said, "but we're going to figure it out together. We're going to make mistakes and learn from them. We're going to be exhausted and overwhelmed and probably terrible at swaddling. But Maya, this little girl is going to be so loved. She's going to grow up knowing that family isn't just about biology. It's about choice and commitment and showing up every single day." The conviction in his voice made Maya's eyes fill with tears, the happy kind that seemed to come so easily these days. "I love you," she said, the words still feeling new and precious on her tongue. "I love you so much, Adrian, and I'm so grateful that you walked into that restaurant and saw me. Really saw me." He kissed her softly, a promise and a benediction. "I'm the one who's grateful," he murmured against her lips. "You gave me a reason to be more than just successful. You gave me a reason to be human again." That night, as they lay together in the master bedroom, Maya's head resting on Adrian's chest while his hand traced lazy circles on her belly, she thought about the impossible journey that had brought them here. 6 months ago, she'd been drowning, alone, and terrified. She'd been a waitress with no prospects, an ex-husband who'd destroyed her trust, and a pregnancy that felt like a prison sentence rather than a blessing. Now she was here, in a home filled with love and security, with a man who'd chosen her and their daughter without reservation, with a future that looked nothing like the bleak landscape she'd imagined. It wasn't a fairy tale. There had been too much pain, too many battles, too much public scrutiny for it to be that simple, but it was real. It was hers, and that made it more valuable than any fantasy. As Maya drifted towards sleep, she felt their daughter kick strongly against Adrian's palm, and she heard his soft laugh of delight in the darkness. This was what happiness felt like, she realized. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of someone who chose to struggle alongside you. Not the fantasy of perfection, but the reality of imperfect people building something beautiful together. And as consciousness faded into dreams, Maya's last thought was a simple one, a benediction for the life growing inside her and the man who held them both. "We made it. We're going to be okay. Labor began on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days before Maya's due date, with a sensation that started as mild discomfort and escalated into something that made her understand why they called it labor. She was in the nursery, folding tiny clothes that seemed impossibly small to fit a human being, when the first real contraction seized her, stealing her breath and making her grip the edge of the changing table until her knuckles went white. Adrian was in a meeting downtown discussing a merger that would expand his company into 3 new markets. But when Maya called him with a voice that tried to sound calm but couldn't quite hide the fear, he ended the meeting mid-sentence and left his stunned executives sitting around the conference table. He made it home in record time, finding Maya in the living room practicing the breathing techniques they'd learned in birthing class, her face pale and determined. The hospital bag had been packed for weeks, sitting by the front door like a talisman against the uncertainty of when this moment would arrive. Now that it was here, Maya felt both ready and completely unprepared. Excited and terrified in equal measure. The drive to the hospital was surreal, Adrian gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles while trying to project a calm he clearly didn't feel. Maya breathing through contractions and watching the city slide past the windows like a movie she was only half paying attention to. She thought about how different this moment would have been if Adrian hadn't walked into that restaurant 7 months ago. She would have been alone, probably taking a bus or a taxi she couldn't afford, terrified not just of the birth but of everything that came after. Instead, she had Adrian's hand to hold, Adrian's voice reassuring her that everything was going to be okay, Adrian's presence transforming fear into something she could manage. At the hospital, they'd arranged for a private birthing suite kind of accommodation that came with extra nurses, better equipment, and the assurance that Maya's comfort and privacy were priorities rather than luxuries. Catherine had even arranged for security, discreet but present, just in case. Marcus somehow learned about the birth and decided to make a final desperate attempt to insert himself into the story. Labor progressed slowly, the way first labors often do, hours stretching into more hours while Maya walked the halls, bounced on an exercise ball, and breathed through waves of pain that built and crested and receded with relentless rhythm. Adrian never left her side, holding her hand through every contraction, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when she was convinced she couldn't do this, that it was too much, that she'd made a terrible mistake thinking she could be a mother. "You're the strongest person I know," he told her during one particularly brutal contraction. "You survived, Marcus. You survived poverty and fear and uncertainty. You can survive this. And on the other side is our daughter Maya, our little girl who's fighting just as hard as you are to get here." The conviction in his voice, the absolute certainty that she was capable of this impossible task, gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. 16 hours after labor, in the early hours of Wednesday morning when the world outside was dark and quiet, Maya brought their daughter into the world with a final desperate push and a cry that was equal parts pain and triumph and overwhelming relief. The baby emerged pink and screaming, her tiny face scrunched up in indignation at this bright, cold new world, and the nurse placed her on Maya's chest while Maya sobbed with joy and exhaustion, and a love so fierce it felt like her heart might explode. "She's perfect," Maya whispered, her hands trembling as she touched her daughter's impossibly soft skin, counted her tiny fingers and toes, marveled at the dark fuzz of hair on her head. "She's absolutely perfect." Adrian stood beside the bed, tears streaming down his face, looking at the baby with an expression of such pure wonder that it made Maya cry even harder. "Can I?" he asked, his voice breaking, and Maya nodded, unable to speak. He reached out with shaking hands, and the nurse helped him lift the baby, showing him how to support her head, how to cradle her against his chest. Adrian held his daughter for the first time, and Maya watched as something fundamental shifted in him. This wasn't the billionaire CEO or the calculated strategist or the man wounded by past betrayals. This was a father, overwhelmed and awed and completely transformed by the tiny life in his arms. "Hello, Sophia," he whispered, using the name they'd chosen weeks ago. "I'm your daddy. I've been waiting my whole life to meet you." The moment was sacred, perfect, a pocket of peace in a world that had been chaos for so long. But even perfect moments exist in reality, and reality has a way of intruding. 3 hours after Sophia's birth, while Maya was sleeping and Adrian sat in the chair beside her bed with Sophia sleeping in his arms, Sarah Chun appeared in the doorway of the birthing suite. Her expression was apologetic but urgent, and Adrian carefully placed Sophia in the bassinet beside Maya's bed before stepping into the hallway to speak with his assistant. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, already knowing this couldn't be good news. "Marcus Torres is in the hospital," Sarah said quietly. "He came to the emergency room about an hour ago. Attempted suicide, sleeping pills and alcohol. They pumped his stomach and he's gonna survive, but Adrian, he left a note and your name is in it." The exhaustion and euphoria of the past 17 hours evaporated, replaced by cold dread. What did the note say? Sarah pulled out her phone, showing him a photograph that had already been leaked to social media. The note was handwritten, Marcus's normally neat script deteriorating into something jagged and desperate. The note read, "I loved her. That's what none of you understand. I loved Maya and I ruined it. And watching another man live the life that should have been mine has destroyed me. Adrian Westwood didn't steal my wife or my child. I threw them away with my own hands, and I can't live with what I've done. If you're reading this, I'm sorry. To Maya, to the baby, to everyone I've hurt with my selfishness and pride. I'm sorry I wasn't the man I should have. The words were raw, honest in a way Marcus had never been during his public campaign, stripped of ego and posturing. They were the confession of a broken man who'd finally been forced to confront the consequences of his own choices. Adrian felt a complicated mixture of emotions, pity and anger, and something close to grief for the waste of it all. He's going to be under psychiatric observation for at least 72 hours. Sarah continued. The police are treating it as a mental health crisis rather than a criminal matter. But Adrian, the media is already running with this. They're saying your relationship with Maya pushed him over the edge, that your wealth and influence destroyed a troubled man. It's going to be a nightmare to manage. Adrian closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He'd won. Marcus had been defeated. Not by Adrian's lawyers or his money, but by his own demons and the realization that he'd destroyed the one thing worth having. But victory felt hollow when it came at such a cost. Do whatever you need to do to manage the press, he told Sarah, but make sure Marcus gets the help he needs. Real help. The best psychiatrists, a proper treatment program. I'll cover the costs if his insurance won't. Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. You're going to pay for his treatment? After everything he's done? Adrian looked back toward the birthing suite where his daughter slept, innocent and perfect, unaware of the complicated adult world she'd been born into. I have everything, Sarah. I have a woman I love and a daughter I'd die for. Marcus has nothing but regrets and pain. If paying for his treatment means he gets a chance to heal, to rebuild his life into something that doesn't revolve around hating me and wanting what I have, then yes, I'll pay for it. That's what having resources. Using them to make things better when you can. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding dawning. I'll make the arrangements, and I'll draft a statement. Adrian returned to the birthing suite, moving quietly so as not to wake Maya. He stood over Sophia's bassinet, watching her sleep, marveling at how something so small could be so transformative. This is what Marcus had thrown away. Not just Maya, but this chance at unconditional love, at being part of something greater than himself. Adrian reached down and gently touched Sophia's cheek, feeling the impossible softness of her skin. I promise you, he whispered to his sleeping daughter, that I will never take this for granted. I will show up for you every single day. I will teach you that love is a choice we make repeatedly, not a feeling that just happens, and I will make sure you never doubt, not for a single moment, that you are wanted and cherished, and absolutely perfect exactly as you are. Maya's voice, rough from sleep and exertion, came from the bed. That's a pretty good promise. He turned to find her watching, her eyes tired but full of love. He crossed to the bed and sat carefully on the edge, taking her hand. How much did you hear? Enough to know that Marcus is in the hospital, and you're paying for his treatment despite the fact that he's made our lives hell for 7 months. Maya squeezed his hand. That's who you are, Adrian. That's why I love you. You could destroy him completely, and instead, you're trying to save him. Adrian kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her beside him. He's Sophia's biological father, even if he has no legal claim to her. One day she might want to know about him, to understand where she came from. I'd rather she learned that he got help and rebuilt his life than that he destroyed himself. Maya's eyes filled with tears. Have I mentioned today that you're an extraordinary man? Not since this morning, Adrian said with a tired smile. Maya pulled him down for a kiss, gentle and sweet, full of gratitude and love and exhaustion. When they pulled apart, Sophia began to fuss in her bassinet. Tiny newborn sounds that quickly escalated toward a full cry. Time for her first feeding, the nurse said, appearing in the doorway with perfect timing. She helped Maya position Sophia, guiding the baby to latch, and Adrian watched in awe as his daughter instinctively knew what to do. As Maya transformed before his eyes into a mother, competent and natural despite never having done this before. As morning light began to filter through the hospital windows, painting everything in shades of gold and rose, Adrian looked at his family, this improbable, perfect family he'd found in the unlikeliest of circumstances, and he felt something he'd been chasing his entire adult life without knowing what it was. He felt complete. He felt home. 6 months after Sophia's birth, Maya stood in the garden behind the townhouse, watching autumn leaves drift down from the trees in shades of amber and crimson. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth and the distant promise of winter. Sophia slept peacefully in her stroller, her cheeks pink from the cool air, her tiny fists curled beside her face. She looked more like Maya every day, with dark hair that was already beginning to curl and eyes that had settled into a warm brown that reminded Adrian of polished wood. But she had gestures that were purely her own, a way of scrunching up her nose when she was thinking, a laugh that sounded like silver bells. She was perfect in the way that all babies are perfect, but she was theirs in a way that transcended genetics and biology. She was theirs because they had chosen her, protected her, loved her into being the center of their world. The past 6 months had been a blur of sleepless nights and first smiles, of learning to navigate parenthood with all its unexpected challenges and incomparable joys. Adrian had taken paternity leave, something unheard of for a CEO of his stature. and spent those precious first months fully present, changing diapers at 3 in the morning, walking the floor with a fussy baby, learning to read Sophia's different cries and what each one meant. He'd been clumsy at first, his capable hands that could negotiate billion-dollar deals fumbling with tiny snaps on onesies, his strategic mind utterly baffled by the chaos a 7-pound human could create. But he'd learned with the dedication he brought to everything, and now he could swaddle Sophia with the precision of a pediatric nurse and decode her needs with the intuition of someone who'd been doing this forever. Maya had watched him transform from a man playing at fatherhood into a man who simply was a father, the role no longer something he wore but something he embodied completely. Their life had settled into rhythms that felt both extraordinary and beautifully ordinary. They were a family navigating the same challenges every new family faced, united by love and commitment and the shared exhaustion that came with caring for an infant. But the shadow of their unusual beginning never fully disappeared. Marcus's suicide attempt had dominated headlines for weeks, with endless speculation about responsibility and blame. Adrian's decision to pay for Marcus's treatment had been seen as either magnanimous or manipulative, depending on who was commenting. But slowly, as Marcus disappeared from public view and entered a long-term treatment facility, the story had faded from the news cycle. Other scandals had emerged to capture public attention, and Maya and Adrian had been granted the privacy they desperately wanted. Marcus himself had sent a single letter, 3 months after Sophia's birth. It had arrived through his therapist, carefully screened to ensure it contained nothing threatening or inappropriate. Maya had opened it with trembling hands, Adrian beside her, both of them prepared for anger or manipulation or another desperate play for relevance. Instead, they'd found something raw and honest. Marcus had written about his time in treatment, about the work he was doing to understand the jealousy and inadequacy that had driven his destructive behavior. He acknowledged the affair, the abandonment, the public campaign of harassment. He took responsibility in a way he'd never done before, without excuses or attempts to shift blame. He thanked Adrian for the treatment, acknowledging that he didn't deserve the generosity but was grateful for it nonetheless. And he addressed Maya directly, apologizing for the pain he'd caused, for failing to be the husband she'd deserved, for trying to claim a child he had no right to. He said he was working toward becoming a better man, not for her or for any chance of reconciliation, but for himself, so he could live with what he'd done. He ended the letter with a simple request that they not respond, that they let him work through his recovery without the complication of ongoing contact, and that they build a beautiful life with Sophia without any shadow from it. Maya had cried after reading it, grieving for the man Marcus might have been if he'd found help sooner, if pride hadn't poisoned him, if circumstances had been different. But she also felt a door closing, a chapter ending, and the relief that came with knowing they could truly move forward now. 3 weeks ago, Adrian had asked Maya to marry him. The proposal hadn't been grand or public or anything like the society engagement he'd had with Victoria years before. It had been intimate and perfect, just the two of them and Sophia in the nursery at midnight after they'd finally gotten the baby back to sleep following a difficult evening of colic. Adrian had been holding Sophia, swaying gently, when he'd looked at Maya with such open love that it had stolen her breath. "I want to make this official," he'd said quietly. "I want the world to know that you're not just the mother of my child, but my partner, my equal, my choice for every day of the rest of my life. Will you marry me, Maya? Will you let me spend forever showing you what real love looks like?" She'd said yes through happy tears, and he'd kissed her softly, mindful of the sleeping baby in his arm. And in that moment, Maya had felt the final piece of her healing click into place. She was no longer the waitress drowning in medical bills and broken dreams. She was Maya Torres, soon to be Maya Westwood, mother, partner. A woman who'd survived betrayal and emerged stronger, who'd accepted help when she needed it and turned it into something beautiful. The wedding was planned for spring, a small ceremony in the garden of the townhouse with only their closest friends and family. Caroline would be Adrian's best woman. Sarah would stand up for Maya, who had no siblings but had found a sister of sorts in Adrian's loyalty. Sophia would be there in a tiny white dress, probably fussing through the vows, but perfect nonetheless. It wouldn't be the society wedding people might expect from someone of Adrian's wealth, but it would be theirs. Authentic and meaningful, a celebration of the family they'd built from the wreckage of 2 broken lives. As Maya stood in the garden that October morning, watching leaves fall and listening to her daughter's peaceful breathing, she thought about the impossible journey that had brought her here. She thought about that night at Luminar, the moment when desperation had driven her to confess her pregnancy, when Adrian had made his stunning declaration. She thought about how close she'd come to refusing his help, to letting pride keep her trapped in a cycle of poverty and fear. She thought about all the moments of doubt, the nights when she'd wondered if she was making a terrible mistake, if this arrangement would collapse and leave her worse off than before. But it hadn't collapsed. It had grown and evolved and transformed into something neither of them could have predicted. They'd become a family not through traditional means but through choice, through showing up for each other day after day, through learning that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but about consistent, committed presence. Adrian had taught her that wealth wasn't inherently corrupting, that power could be used generously, that privilege came with responsibility to help those who had less. And she'd taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that needing someone didn't diminish you, that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought or negotiated but only received with gratitude and humility. They'd saved each other, not in the dramatic fairy tale sense, but in the quiet, daily way that people who truly love each other always do. Behind her, Maya heard the back door open and turned to see Adrian stepping into the garden, 2 mugs of coffee in his hand. He'd been up early taking a call with overseas investors, but he'd changed into casual clothes and looked relaxed, content, more like the man he was becoming than the guarded billionaire he'd been when they met. "Morning," he said, handing her a mug. He bent to check on Sophia, his hand gentle on her cheek, and Maya watched the unconscious tenderness of the gesture. Every time she saw him with their daughter, she fell in love with him a little more. "How is she?" "Perfect," Maya said, taking a sip of coffee that was exactly the right temperature with exactly the right amount of cream. He'd learned her preferences, remembered them, cared enough to get them right every single time. "She's always perfect when she's sleeping." Adrian laughed and wrapped his arm around Maya's waist, pulling her close. "We should enjoy it while it lasts. In about 20 minutes, she's going to wake up demanding food and attention, and our peaceful morning will be over." Maya leaned into his warmth, feeling the solid reality of him beside her, the way they fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been searching for each other across the chaos of life. "I wouldn't trade it for anything," she said. "Not the sleepless nights or the chaos or any of it. This is everything I never knew I needed." Adrian pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the leaves fall and their daughter sleep. Two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way and built something that would outlast them both. Somewhere in the city, Marcus Torres was working through his recovery, rebuilding a life that didn't revolve around bitterness and regret. Daniel was living happily in Seattle, his gracious acceptance of the situation a gift that Maya would always be grateful for. The protesters and critics and endless social media commentators had moved on to other targets, other stories. The world kept turning, indifferent to the small miracles happening in one townhouse in Riverside Heights. But for Maya and Adrian and Sophia, this was everything. This quiet morning, this ordinary moment, this family they'd chosen and built and protected. As Sophia began to stir in her stroller, her tiny face scrunching up in preparation for her morning demand, Maya and Adrian exchanged a look that communicated everything without words. They were ready for the crying and the chaos, for the challenges that lay ahead, for the teenage years and college applications and weddings of their own that seemed impossibly distant but would arrive faster than they could imagine. They were ready because they had each other, because love had found them in the least likely place and transformed them both. A single sentence in a late-night restaurant had set everything in motion, a confession born of desperation that had become a declaration of hope. Maya had said she was pregnant, Adrian had claimed her child as his own, and Marcus had collapsed under the weight of his own failure. But from that moment of chaos and pain had emerged something beautiful, something that proved that family wasn't about biology or tradition or the way things were supposed to be. Family was about choice and commitment and showing up when it mattered. It was about Adrian Westwood, a billionaire who'd been searching for purpose, finding it in a waitress who needed help and a baby who needed a father. It was about Maya Torres, a woman who'd survived betrayal, learning to trust again and accepting that sometimes rescue came from unexpected places. It was about Sophia, innocent and perfect, growing up knowing she was wanted beyond measure. As they carried their daughter inside, ready to start another ordinary, extraordinary day, Maya looked back at the garden one last time. The leaves were still falling, painting the world in autumn colors, marking the passage of time and the changing of seasons. Everything changed eventually. People grew and transformed and became versions of themselves they'd never imagined. But some things, the important things, remained constant. Love remained, family remained. The choice to show up day after day for the people who mattered most, that remained. And in a world that often felt uncertain and harsh, that was enough. That was everything. If this story of unexpected love, second chances, and the incredible power of choosing to be present moved you, remember that every family has its own origin story. Some begin with love at first sight, others with carefully planned decisions, and some, like Maya and Adrian's, begin with an impossible declaration in a crowded restaurant. What matters isn't how the story starts, but how we choose to write the chapters that follow. This was their beginning. The rest was still being written, one beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary day at a time.